Hi everyone, today we're going to be continuing our discussion of John Locke by looking at his arguments against the existence of innate ideas. So in this video, we're going to be talking about, well, what exactly are ideas? And then we'll look at what is this doctrine of innate ideas, and we'll look at the universal assent argument in favor of this doctrine, what the argument is, and then Locke's objections to this argument. So what does Locke mean by an idea? He says, I must here in the entrance beg pardon of my reader for the frequent use of the word idea, which you will find in the following treatise. It being that term which I think best serves best to stand for, whatever is the object of the understanding when a person thinks. I've used it to express whatever is meant by phantasm, notion, species, or whatever it is which the mind can be employed about in thinking, and I could not avoid frequently using it. Right, so he's saying, look, people have used other terms, but I'm going to use the term idea just as a word that's meant to stand for whatever those objects are that are in our understanding when we think about or represent sort of things within our mind. So I have an idea of the tree. That idea is just whatever is in my mind, in my understanding when I think about that tree. Notice, an idea here is not the same thing as a perception or a sensation. So when I look at the tree and touch the tree, I might also be thinking about the tree. But I can think about that tree when I'm not sensing it, when I don't see it, when I don't feel it, when I don't smell it. Similarly, we also need to distinguish ideas from beliefs. I can have ideas of things that exist, like the tree, the computer, my hands. But I can also have ideas of things that don't exist, like unicorns or Santa Claus. Now, I can also have ideas about things that I don't know if they exist or whether they don't exist. I'm just sort of agnostic. So I have an idea about aliens. So that idea is just whatever thing it is in my mind that represents that object, an alien or a unicorn or a table or a chair. Those are all different ideas in my mind. Today, we would usually use the term concept. So he says it's an established opinion among some people that there are in the understanding certain innate principles, some primary notions, characters as it were, stamped upon the mind of persons, which the soul receives in its very first being and brings into the world with it. So the idea here is that we are built with certain principles, certain information already included in our nature, so to speak. We we come into the world with this information already sort of packed into our minds. So the doctrine of innate ideas and knowledge, which we should separate since they're not the same thing, is this idea that human beings are born with certain ideas and knowledge. Now, when Locke talks about innate principles, he uses this both to cover ideas that are in our mind and also knowledge or truths that are in our mind. So we could talk about the doctrine of innate ideas, or we could talk about the doctrine of innate knowledge. We should actually probably keep these separate. The claim here is that human beings are born with certain ideas or certain knowledge that's already included among the materials of their mind. So having this included in our mind is just part of our nature. It's part of the way we're built, either by God or by some purely natural process like evolution. So according to Locke, this doctrine of innate ideas is an empirical hypothesis. There's no contradiction in saying that we're born without ideas or principles in our minds. And so we need to look at evidence for and against this hypothesis to decide if it's true. And Locke, in the end, when he does this, he ends up rejecting the doctrine of innate ideas because when he makes his observations of the world, he finds no evidence in favor of this doctrine, and he finds a lot of evidence against the doctrine. And so he rejects that there are any innate theoretical or speculative principles, such as something cannot be both true and false at the same time. So he's going to say, look, that might be true, but it's not innate. That truth is not innate to us. He also rejects that there are any innate moral principles in human minds, such as the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated. He says, look, that might be a principle you believe, but that principle is not innate. And he also rejects the claim that we have any innate ideas, say, of God or anything else. All right, so why might someone believe the doctrine of innate ideas or of innate knowledge? Well, Locke suggests that many people hold the view on the basis of the following argument. He says, there's nothing more commonly taken for granted than that there are certain principles, both speculative and practical, universally agreed upon by all mankind, which, therefore, they argue, must necessarily be the constant impressions which the souls of people receive in their first beings, and which they bring into the world with them, as necessarily and really as they do any of their inherent faculties. So here's the argument from universal assent, as I'm going to reconstruct it. There are some principles, either speculative, so theoretical, and practical, moral, that are universally agreed upon by all people. If a principle is universally agreed upon, then that principle must be innate to human beings. It must be part of our nature. Therefore, there are some innate principles. All right. So this is a deductively valid argument. It's just a case of modus ponens, essentially. The question is it sound? Are those premises true? So let's consider this first premise, that there's some principles that are universally agreed upon by all people. You might be thinking, oh, look, that can't be true. People disagree about so much stuff. But look, we disagree about religion, we disagree about politics, we disagree about morality. There seems to be disagreement everywhere. Even like scientists disagree with each other. They have competing theories about how the world works. But this doesn't say that human beings agree on everything. It just says there are some. There's at least one thing that is universally agreed upon. So all you need is one example. And here's some examples that people sometimes give of things that they think would be universally assented to by all people. So the claim that whatever is. I mean, this seems trivial, right? Or it's impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. So something can't exist and not exist at the same time. A equals A. So everything is identical to itself. Something cannot be both true and false at the same time. So these things are so obvious as to seem sort of trivial, but they're still truths. What about premise 2? Why should I believe this? Well, if a principle is universally agreed upon, why should I think that it has to be innate? So the idea seems to be that there would be disagreement about these principles unless the information was just included as part of our human nature. That is, we're all human beings, and that is, if it's not part of our nature to believe these things, then we'd expect some people not to believe them, not to assent to them. And so this must be sort of included in part of our nature that we share, and that's why we all agree to them. But if that information is included as part of our nature, if that's sort of how we're built, then those principles seem to be innate. But Locke rejects both of these premises. He thinks both of these claims are false. So first, this idea that if it's universally agreed upon, then it must be innate. He says, if it were true in matter of fact that there were certain truths in which all mankind agreed. So he says, even if people universally agreed upon something, he says, that does not prove them innate. If there can be any other way shown how people might come to that agreement in the things they do consent in, which I presume may be done. So he hasn't done this yet, but he thinks he can show how, even if this isn't part of our nature, even if this isn't sort of innately imprinted upon our minds, he thinks he can show other mechanisms by which we might come to universally agree or assent to these claims, and so we don't need to posit innate principles to explain this universal agreement. But moreover, he says, this other premise isn't true either, though. He says there aren't any principles, speculative or practical, that are universally agreed upon. But yet I take liberty to say that these propositions are so far from having a universal assent that there's a great part of humankind to whom they are not so much as known. So he says, look, even these abstract principles that you sort of put forward that seem trivial, it's not just that there's some people that will disagree. He thinks there's a large number of people that will not assent to these claims, and thus we don't have this universal assent in the first place. All right, so against this universal assent, he says, These principles are not known to children. Look, if I ask my daughter, can something be both true and false at the same time? She's not going to assent to that. She's not going to agree. She's likely not even going to understand what I'm saying. Or if I say everything is identical to itself, I'm not sure that my daughter can even comprehend what I'm asking, and so she can't assent to it. He also says these principles are not known to idiots. So many people, idiots is not a appropriate term, but it's the term that Locke uses during this time. The idea here is there are certain people that have certain sort of mental disabilities that might prevent them from being able to understand these abstract sort of logical principles, and thus they will not be able to assent to those principles. And Locke claims that to imprint anything on the mind without the mind's perceiving it seems to me hardly intelligible. To say a notion is imprinted on the mind, and yet at the same time to say that the mind is ignorant of it and never yet took notice of it, is to make this impression nothing. No proposition can be said to be in the mind which it never knew, which it was never yet conscious of. So the idea is, if these are not known by children or by severely mentally disabled human beings, then he says, if it's not known, then it's not in the mind at all. It's not imprinted on the mind. Because that truth, that information can't be presented to the mind if the mind is not aware of it, if the mind does not know it. And so the fact that these people do not know these propositions, these claims, means that that information, those truths, are not innately imprinted on them. All right, but there is a potential reply here. Maybe we should think of innate principles as dispositional. So these ideas or knowledge that's supposed to be innate, we should think of it as some sort of a disposition that's included in our nature. So a principle is innate when we are born with a certain disposition to be conscious of or know the idea under the right conditions. All right. So here's an analogy. So fragility is a disposition. So to say that a glass is fragile doesn't mean that it's broken right now or that it's ever been broken. Rather, it means that the glass is constructed in such a way that under certain conditions, like chucking against the wall, in that condition, it would break. So right now, the glass has the feature of being fragile, but that fragility is understood as a disposition, as a power such that it would break under the right kind of conditions. So similarly, maybe we should think innate principles as a kind of disposition, as a kind of power that we are born with. So we're constructed by God or evolution such that under the right conditions, this power would then sort of activate, and we would become conscious of or come to know these ideas or truths that were already sort of implicitly or tacitly included in our minds. So the idea is the power to know these things is already present, but then under the right conditions, that's what it is for it to be sort of innate. But under the right conditions, that power that is already present then sort of gets manifested in those conditions. Just like there's the power of the glass to break, and then when I chuck it against the wall and it hits there, that power then sort of manifests itself. The fragility was always there. It just didn't sort of activate until I smashed it against the wall. Similarly, that implicit knowledge, that innate knowledge, was always there. It just wasn't activated yet. So a child might not currently know that it's impossible for the same thing to be and not be. However, on this kind of view, the child still has that innate principle because the child has a nature. They were constructed in such a way that all we need to do is put them in the right conditions. And when I do, that will be enough to activate this knowledge that's there, and they will then become conscious of it. So that's it for this video, though. In the next video, we're going to consider Locke's arguments against this dispositional account of innate ideas and principles. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.